Welcome back to the Everyone is Azor Ahai, well, kind of, only the POV characters whose names are the titles of their chapters theory. Last time we rattled through a bunch of possible Azor Ahais to add to our list. Jaime, Brienne, Cersei, Dany, Jon, Bran, and Tyrion, the last of which we left hanging until this episode. To fully integrate him into the theory, we need to consider Davos. Davos? Azor Ahai? It's more likely than you think. First of all, let's talk about the Salt and the Smoke, seeing as it's the same as for Tyrion. You may recall that at the end of Clash of Kings, Davos dies. Don't remember that? The chapter ends with Davos in the water, surrounded by wildfire and burning ships, hoping to get to safety by swimming out to the open sea. But Tyrion's chain has blocked the way out by causing all the burning ships to pile up, forming a wall that Davos can't get past. The chapter ends, and it's the last we see of Davos in that book. There is no way presented that he could survive. Let me put it another way. A lot of people seem to think that Quentyn Martell is still alive, despite the fact that we saw his burnt corpse in Dance. Well, we don't see that for Davos in Clash, but we get the closest thing to it. If you were theorising in 1999 that Davos was still alive, you'd probably get the same incredulous reception that Quentyn truthers get today. Gurm has done fake-out deaths before, a lot, but there is generally an in-universe reason given for why a character survives. Arya didn't die from being hit in the head with the Hound's axe because it was a blunt end. Tyrion was rescued from drowning by Jon Connington. Brienne must have convinced Stoneheart not to hang her with that single word she shouted, apparently sword. But when Davos returns in Storm, no explanation is given. He just washes up on a rocky island. In fact, Gurm explains how he might have done it in a memory, diving down and waiting for the current to wash him under the chain, but then actively rejects that. Davos got turned around under the water and panicked. I'm just going to read the passage from Davos 1 that shows just how dead he is. He twisted in the water to look up, but there was nothing to see but green darkness. And then he spun too far, and suddenly he could no longer tell up from down. Panic took hold of him. His hands flailed against the bottom of the river and sent up a cloud of mud that blinded him. His chest was growing tighter by the instant. He clawed at the water, kicking, pushing himself, turning, his lungs screaming for air, kicking until he could kick no longer. When he opened his mouth to scream, the water came rushing in, tasting of salt, and Davos Seaworth knew that he was drowning. And how does Davos survive this? We don't know. The very next line is, "The next he knew the sun was up, and he lay upon a stony strand beneath a spire of naked stone." Now, this is an interesting choice. The author gives us a way for Davos to survive, then has him fail. There's not even any tension created by this, because it's a flashback and we know Davos survives as we're reading this. Why do this at all? There had been some setup in Clash for Davos to survive in this manner. He doesn't wear armour like the Knights do, and we're reminded of this in Storm, so he can at least swim. But this is deliberately thrown away in favour of a Deus Ex Machina. We must ask the question, who, or what, saved Davos? We do have precedent for characters inexplicably surviving being drowned. Patchface, who washed up on the shore 3 days after the ship he was on went down, killing Steffon Baratheon and everyone else on board. When Patchface is found, his skin is clammy cold, but then he wakes up. Davos even draws a connection when talking to Salador Saan. Davos was reminded of Patchface. He had gone into the sea as well. And when he came out he was mad. Am I mad as well? When Davos next sees Patchface, the fool jerked to a sudden halt, and gives him a handy prophecy about the Red Wedding that unfortunately Davos doesn't pass on to anyone. Patchface also tells Davos that under the sea the old fish eat the young fish, when he goes up to learn to read from Maester Pylos, to which Davos replies, "Up here the young fish teach the old fish." Patchface even gave Davos a prophecy of his demise in his very first chapter. Under the sea the smoke rises in bubbles, and flames burn green and blue and black, referencing the blackwater when green flames burn on the black water. The problem with Davos being another Patchface is that he isn't mad. But the link is still obvious, and the fact that Patchface seemed to die and come back to life is notable. This is similar to how Aeron and the priests of the drowned god deliberately drown people and then bring them back to life with CPR. However, Patchface and Davos are purer versions of Aeron's drowned men. Not only did they not need CPR, they were drowned for much longer, and in an interview Gurm has said no when asked, are the drowned men truly drowned? This separates Davos' resurrection from someone like Aeron. And yes, I do believe it is a resurrection, a rebirth if you will. And if there is any one place where you can find salt, smoke, and the bleeding star in A Song of Ice and Fire, the Battle of the Blackwater is that place. The Blackwater is salty, which we are told as Davos is dying. The water came rushing in, tasting of salt, and the wildfire provides a lot of smoke. Moreover, most of the Azor Ahai candidacies take some liberties with the word amidst salt and smoke, mainly because salt is generally seawater and fire and water don't mix, unless of course you have wildfire. Davos fits this part of the prophecy probably the most out of any of our POV characters, more than Jon and even more than Dany, who has to rely on sweat or tears for salt. Chew on that one for a minute. And before I go any further, this is where Tyrion can have his rebirth as well. He is injured so badly at the Blackwater that he is bedridden for days, and his near death is accompanied by a drastic change in his life, going from a hand of the king in his ascendancy to a mutilated has-been deserted by his allies and usurped his hand by Tywin. The lack of gratitude shown by the common people, his family and the court for his saving of the city, is arguably the thing which sets him off down his path towards being hateful and destructive. Although, by the way, all he really did was order a chain to be built and lead one contingent. It's a bit much to say he saved the city. Anyway, Tyrion's rebirth can be at the Blackwater, just as Davos's is. Back to Davos, because if he was saved by the Drown God like Patchface maybe was, that isn't great for his Azor Ahai claims. However, as well as not being insane from witnessing some horrendous Lovecraftian sea monster, Davos is distinct from Patchface in a number of different ways, a lot of which have to do with Melisandre. For example, Melisandre talks about Patchface in dance. That creature is dangerous. Many a time I have glimpsed him in my flames. Sometimes there are skulls about him, and his lips are red with blood. By contrast, Melisandre is strangely much more favourable to Davos, even though he hates her and actually tries to kill her after his resurrection. In Dance she says of Davos that, misguided as he was, his loyalty to Stannis could not be doubted. She had seen that in her flames. Most striking is her visit to him when he's in the cells after trying to kill her. She taunts him a bit, threatens to take away his torch and so on, but then offers him the chance to make a shadow demon, if you know what I mean. Davos naturally declines, but that the offer was even made is extremely odd. As far as we know, not just anybody can make shadow demons. Melisandre is only asking because Stannis' life force is being drained. She has to use him because he has Kingsblood. If anyone could do it, she could just ask any of the devout Queen's men to visit her bedchamber. The idea of blood, particularly King's blood, being important is central to Melisandre's beliefs. She wants to burn Edric's storm, Melisandre's son, and so on. Why ask Davos for some life force then? He's as low one as it gets, no way he has any King's blood in him. Well, it's notable that she asks this after his resurrection, not before. Whereas Patchface is a monster because of his drowning, Davos is something like a king, perhaps even an Azor Ahai. She even takes some time to try to convert Davos, going so far as to describe Stannis as yet another vain king on yet another empty throne. Pretty treasonous to be saying out loud. She recounts the prophecy of Azor Ahai to him, and tells him, "You doubt the truth of R'hllor even now, yet you have served him all the same, and will serve him again." Afterwards, Davos looks at the torch and tries to see something in the flames, but can't. This might be a point against him being Azor Ahai, but for what Melisandre says in her sermon. The other servants oft hide black hearts in gaudy light, so R'hllor gives his priests the power to see through falsehoods. A lot of the visions Melisandre has turn out to be misinterpretations, but Davos sees through these. Even Melisandre in her chapter thinks about how some red priests only see what they want to see. Davos sees what is really there, just fire. There are other strange connections between Melisandre and Davos. When talking to Jon Snow about glamours, Melisandre says that it helps to have something that belonged to a person if you want to impersonate them. She lists some examples: a dead man's boots, a hank of hair, a bag of finger bones. The first two are quite generic, the last are very specific. Davos had his finger bones that Stannis cut off in a bag around his neck for luck, but he lost it in the Blackwater. What could Melisandre possibly mean by mentioning this to Jon, someone who has never met Davos and therefore wouldn't get the reference? It's very puzzling. It might just be that Melisandre was reminded of bones because they're talking about Mance Rayder, who was disguised by wearing Rattleshirt's bone armor, but even then it's something of a leap to Davos' bones specifically. There's a lot of ways this could mean something, but let's take the most basic thing it must mean. Melisandre is thinking about Davos, a man who is not hugely important, is not even there, and doesn't believe in R'hllor at all. We already have Melisandre as a character who gets actual visions of Azor Ahai, Jon Snow and maybe Bran, but ignores them in favour of Stannis. Could the image of Davos that she saw in the flames have also come up when looking for a vision of Azor Ahai? That's just speculation though, so let's move on to something with some textual support. Let's talk about Davos' main contributions to the plot in Book 3. First, he rescues Edric's storm and sends him off to Lys without consulting Stannis, and second, he convinces Stannis to go to the wall to help against the wildlings and others. Let's deal with the first one first. In Davos 5, Melisandre asks Stannis to give her Edric's storm to burn, in order to wake the stone dragons on Dragonstone and give Stannis the power to conquer Westeros. We start out with Stannis and Melisandre reminding us that the visions are often wrong. Stannis says, "Even when these flames speak truly, they are full of tricks, it seems to me." This is unsurprising, given he did some blood sacrifice to kill Balon Greyjoy and Robb Stark, and it seems to have worked. But now, more false kings will soon rise to take up the crowns of those who died, according to Melisandre, which, by the way, is true for Balon, but not Robb, at least not yet. She admits that an ant who hears the words of a king may not comprehend what he is saying, and all men are ants before the fiery face of God. She says, "If sometimes I have mistaken a warning for a prophecy, or a prophecy for a warning, the fault lies in the reader, not the book. This is quite the line. First of all, it seems a bit like Germ from the past saying, hey, it's not my fault if you come up with all these crazy theories and then they don't happen, which is fair enough. This theory is more of a fun idea, by the way, rather than something I think is gospel. But this line is also an admission of Melisandre's fallibility, 2 books and 10 years before a POV chapter in Dance. The wording is also interesting. Prophecies and warnings being mistaken for one another. This isn't hugely relevant to what they're talking about. The problem Stannis has is that the flames are tricksy. Melisandre seems to be implying that something you might think is a prophecy of a saviour coming to the rescue, Azor Ahai, could actually be a warning of something bad happening, and the other way around. She misinterprets Bran and Bloodraven as warnings when they're probably prophetic, and does the same with Jon Snow, thinking it's all about avoiding the daggers in the dark when actually his death may be necessary for him to be reborn as Azor Ahai. As for something that's actually in this book, it's crucial that this is the same chapter in which the burning of Edric's Storm is being discussed. More on that in a moment. Anyway, after this, Melisandre says she is certain of one thing. You must show the realm a sign that proves your power. I'm going to argue that this is actually true, and Melisandre is certain of it. She has doubts about something else though, what that sign of power should be. Queen Selyse and Axel Florent then take up the argument, urging Stannis to burn Edric's Storm, and only after they have badgered him into admitting that he was sick to death of this wretched boy before he was even born, does Melisandre chip in and ask to burn him. She likely wasn't sure, and interprets Stannis' apparent acceptance of the idea as a sign that it is the right thing to do. Then, like any good zealot, immediately commits entirely to the idea of burning Edric. Davos is the sole objecting voice in the room. Salladhor Saan weirdly dematerializes after telling Stannis about the Red Wedding, and eventually convinces Stannis to wait because Joffrey is not dead. 2 working blood sacrifices might just be a coincidence, especially if the third hasn't worked yet. Davos and Stannis then have an argument about burning Edric's Storm, Stannis pointing out quite reasonably that if it saves the realm, it is the morally right thing to do. This speech is also chock full of more references to Davos being Azor Ahai. He mentions one of Melisandre's prophecies about a hero reborn in the sea, and talks of how he sees him in the flames with lightbringer raised high. There is a part of this theory that I will talk about later, that Davos' role as Azor Ahai could be that he represents lightbringer, and Stannis has certainly raised Davos high, as a knight, then a lord, and then the king's hand. Finally, Stannis notes that his sword didn't help him on the Blackwater, but a dragon could, implying that the dragon would be the true lightbringer. But who would have actually helped on the Blackwater if they commanded the fleet instead of the foolish Imry Florent? Why, Davos, of course, who noticed the towers that would raise a chain and might have been able to do something differently. We'll talk more about Davos' lightbringer later, but for now we'll get back to the Edric Storm issue. Davos' opinion on the matter is an interesting one. When Stannis talks of dragons, Davos says, "Your Grace, the cost." Stannis replies, "I know the cost." He asks Davos, "What is the life of one bastard boy against a kingdom?" To which Davos replies, "Everything." It's interesting because Davos doesn't really try to cast doubt on the idea that this would work. Melisandre challenges them that if all 3 kings die after the blood sacrifice, that must show the power of the law at work. Stannis responds, "It might, but the king spoke as if he grudged each word." Davos says, "Or not," which is not much of a comeback. Earlier in this conversation, when Melisandre asks, "Do you doubt the power of the law?" he thinks, "No," and he doesn't try to argue with Stannis over whether the burning of Edric's Storm would work. He merely tries to argue that it's morally wrong regardless. The life of one boy is worth everything against the kingdom. It's a morally absolutist stance, and one that will come across as a bit stupid to many readers, as if the world ends, Edric's Storm will die anyway. Stannis knows it, Melisandre is in the right if burning Edric will indeed work, and he sees the fate of Joffrey as a test of that. So here's where that idea of a warning and a prophecy being mixed up comes in. Melisandre knows that Stannis needs to do something to show power, but she doesn't know what it is, so she settles on burning Edric to wake the stone dragons. Meanwhile, if she sees any visions of up north at all, she likely reinterprets them as warnings of the darkness to come, as she does when she sees Bran and Bloodraven in a POV chapter in Dance. One is a warning, the other a prophecy, but I propose that Melisandre gets them mixed up. The warning is actually not to burn Edric's Storm, the prophecy that Stannis needs to go north. Davos cannot see anything in the flames. He may not doubt R'hllor's power, but he does not see it as a good thing, and his preconceptions do not make him see burning people as always the right answer. Davos actively works to free Edric's Storm and send Stannis north, thus unwittingly helping the Azor Ahai cause. Davos frees Edric's Storm in Davos 6 with the help of other members of the Kingsmen faction. It's notable that Davos does this with a lot of help. Maester Pylos, the Bastard of Night Song, Sir Andrew Estamont, Sir Gerald Gower, Salladhor Saan, Lewis the Fishwife, and Omer Blackberry. You'd be forgiven for not remembering most of those names, but the point is that there are clearly a lot of people willing to risk their lives to save Edric's Storm. Burning him would likely alienate all the Kingsmen, and many more people besides. In the show, the burning of Shireen is a step too far, and leads to many of Stannis' men deserting. The burning of Edric's Storm may well have done the same, dooming Stannis' cause. Moreover, if it didn't work and didn't raise a stone dragon, which seems likely as Melisandre is often wrong about most things, it would be the opposite of a sign of power, rather a sign of weakness, and the limits of her law's magic. If the only thing Melisandre is certain about is that Stannis needs to project some power, then impotently burning his nephew is not only pointless, it's counterproductive, possibly even fatal. By preventing it, Davos is serving his king and, it would seem, helping along the prophecy of Azor Ahai. We constantly hear that knowing about prophecy and trying to fulfill it or avoid it will usually lead to the opposite of what you intend. The only way a good prophecy can be fulfilled is if the participants don't know about it. Davos says, "There's much I don't understand, I've never pretended otherwise," when convincing Stannis to go north, whereas Melisandre is certain that he has doomed them all, saying that, "When the long night falls, Edric's Storm shall die with the rest. You meddle in matters you do not understand." Yet we know from Melisandre's own chapter that she isn't certain, and she does pretend otherwise. Whenever anyone asks her what she sees in the fire, she replies, "Much and more," but seeing was never as simple as those words suggested. Melisandre asks Davos in his cell if his heart burns with the shining light of R'hllor, or is it black and cold and full of worms. She says prior to this that everything is simple, binary, black and white, good and evil, ice and fire, death and life, and her question is the same. "My heart," Davos said slowly, "is full of doubts." Davos is uncertain, and Melisandre chastises him for it. Yet characters who are certain in Gurm's story tend to be undone, and even more so if those are certain about prophecies. Cersei with her Valonqar, Rhaegar, Daemon Blackfire II, the Dothraki with their stallion that mounts the world, probably Aegon V at Summerhall. The list goes on. And finally, Melisandre doesn't see Davos taking Edric in the flames. He sees the flicker of dismay there, the sudden uncertainty. She did not see it. Davos thinks this is because they didn't threaten her personally, but she sees plenty that doesn't concern her. More likely, R'hllor, or whatever exactly is sending these visions, didn't want her to stop Davos' plan, because Davos was doing God's work. But that's not all. Immediately after saving Edric's Storm, Davos sets off to fess up to Stannis and convince him to go north. It's an odd plan, he knows there's a chance he'll die, wondering as he goes into the stone drum if he'll ever come out again, and we know how Stannis deals with crime. He cut Davos' fingers off for smuggling, a fact that is constantly referenced in Davos' chapters, even though Davos saved him and his men from starving to death. What would he do when Davos commits treason by freeing Edric without Stannis' permission? Why does Davos think this is the best time to convince him to go north? And given what we know of Stannis, how on earth does it actually work? It's telling that when we leave Davos, he is reading the letter sent from the wall with Stannis standing above him, lightbringer half-drawn ready to cut his head off if he isn't convinced. Davos' success is pretty incredible, but Stannis does seem to trust him and value his honesty, so it's at least not as ridiculous as Davos surviving the Blackwater. Anyway, the point is that Stannis agrees, heads north, beats the wildlings, and commits to fighting the others, something he didn't even talk about before this point. It doesn't immediately earn him much respect or glory, except in the eyes of some of the Night's Watch, but in Dance it is partly because of his battering of the wildlings that the northern clansmen rally to his side, partly because he also goes to kick the Ironborn out of Deepwood Motte. Davos' actions give Stannis a fighting chance. The ultimate warning of the Red Priests is that the night is dark and full of terrors, but the Night's Watch is ultimately where Stannis must go to face the darkness. Somehow I've ended up writing 5 A4 pages on why Davos is Azor Ahai. I'm not even done yet, so let's do a quick rewind. Reborn amid salt, smoke, and under the bleeding star at the Blackwater. Melisandre sees him in her flames and thinks about him. She tries to convert him and use him to make a shadow demon. Davos is consistently uncertain, not misinterpreting prophetic visions of the future, instead just doing what he thinks is right, whereas Melisandre projects certainty and convinces herself and others of the infallibility of her prophecies, when in fact she herself is uncertain. Finally, Davos does 2 things, freeing Edric's Storm and sending Stannis north, which seems to help Stannis and be good for the fight against the others, despite them both being the opposite of what Melisandre advised, the warning and the prophecy getting mixed up. You might say that if Davos is Azor Ahai because he goes against Melisandre's ideas, then how can Melisandre also be Azor Ahai? Well, I believe she's wrong about most things, but she'll probably take some decision that helps the Azor Ahai cause, like resurrecting Jon Snow. So what's Davos' wider role within the Azor Ahai myth? It is unlikely he'll be a warrior. He's more of a naval man anyway, and his role throughout the story has been as an advisor to Stannis, a supposed Azor Ahai reborn. One theory has Davos as a metaphorical lightbringer. After all, if Lightbringer can be a dragon or a fist, why can't it be a person? I mentioned this earlier with regards to Stannis' speech, but there's more to it. After freeing Edric's Storm, Davos goes and waits in the painted chamber for Stannis, makes a fire to drive the chill from the round chamber and chase the shadows back into their corners, bringing heat and light, and his shadow is tall and thin, falling across the painted table like a sword. When Davos reads the letter from the Night's Watch to Stannis, he does so by the light of the magic sword Lightbringer. As for the parallels to the Azor Ahai legend, the Blackwater provides a lot of these. being tempered in water, being tempered in the blood of the lion, Lannister forces are after all killed, including on the Blackwater, and being tempered in the blood of Nissa. Davos loses 4 sons, one of them on a ship named Lady Maria, after his wife. Davos thus fits a lot of the themes in the story, the tricksiness of prophecies, the peril in being too certain, even the destructive power of the Game of Thrones that took a lowborn smuggler and raised him high, only to kill 4 of his sons, and is probably worse in store. The Lightbringer connections are interesting, but not conclusive. However, there are certain things that show Davos is part of the Azor Ahai story, most notably Melisandre wanting him to make a shadow demon and taking such an interest in him. It is a slight problem that he doesn't do much Azor Ahai related stuff in Dance, and is currently on Skagos looking for Rickon, which also seems unrelated. But perhaps Davos' role is as the advisor, and perhaps he will be the one to convince Wyman Manderly and the Northmen to march to defend the wall once the others attack, as he did with Stannis. Davos is not a leader, can never be a leader, the rigid aristocratic and hierarchical Westerosi society forbids it, but he can be the advisor, lowborn like Littlefinger or Varys, but able to influence kings and countries. With that, I rest my case, for this episode at least. I was hoping to keep this to 2 parts initially, 3 at a stretch, but it now seems pretty clear that's not viable. I still have 6 POV characters to discuss, and if it's not already obvious, I've been leaving the most difficult till last, so buckle up for the next and hopefully last episode, because it's going to be a real tinfoil adventure.